Now, China-Africa cooperation continues to soar. One example of the improving relations between the two is the partnership between Standard Bank and the Industrial and Commercial Bank of China. Now, the banking heavyweights are celebrating 10 years of their strategic partnership.
Back in 2007, ICBC, China's largest bank, bought a 20% stake in Standard Bank. The move increased China's footprint across Africa through funding infrastructure development and helped Standard Bank grow and further expand its reach to become Africa's largest lender, with assets now worth over $165 billion. 106 major projects were put in place across the African continent since this partnership began 10 years ago. More directly, Standard Bank and ICBC is making over $8 billion in financing available for 35 projects across the continent.
The liquefied gas project in Mozambique, it's a game changer for the nation of Mozambique, and indeed a game changer for sub-Saharan Africa. Another transaction that is also public and that we're also proud of is us funding Kafue, a power project in Zambia. It's a unique partnership. And my point about strategy, there are not many institutions that could pull off an arrangement such as that. $8 billion, ICBC looking after the offshore element of the funding, Standard Bank looking after the working capital. Unique, something that we're very proud of.
Much has been achieved, but both parties are looking to strengthen the relationship. South Africa, like the rest of the continent, wants to bulk up its manufacturing capacity to create more value chains. With Africa's growing middle class and the millions of young people entering the workplace every year, China believes Africa presents potential.
African market is huge in potential. The African continent has about 30 million square kilometers, and also it boasts a population of 1.2 billion. And it is also a rapidly developing emerging market. And at the same time, the economic and trade bilateral flows between Africa and China is being further and further promoted. The economic and political neutral trust between Africa and China is also doing well.
We know that the Chinese are going to go where their export growth is fast, where the demand is for the goods. It makes sense for them to logically move. And so that's really the key to creating sustainable ties.
Standard Bank, in the meantime, wants to increase more general and intra-Africa trade and is hoping the infrastructure development projects will start yielding some results in this regard. Sumitra Naidu, CGTN, Johannesburg, South Africa.
Well, let's get an update now from the ground. CGTN's Ramanyang joins us in Johannesburg. Rama, good to see you. Now, let's kick off with that meeting between President Xi and Cyril Ramaphosa yesterday. We saw that meeting bring up an investment commitment by China worth about $14 billion US. Give us a sense of what else came out of that meeting between the two presidents.
Indeed. So, Uche, big numbers coming out of that particular meeting. $14.7 billion in investment commitment, a big slug of that, $2.5 billion going into Eskom, and a fair bit of money also going into Transnet. If you look at what exactly this is going into, it's fairly interesting. It's going into utilities, it's going into logistics as well. Now, Eskom is a particularly interesting case because they did release their financial numbers barely 24 hours ago, and they were rather both disappointing and alarming. A loss of 173, $74 million. And at the same time, they've got a lot of debt on their books, and it's been growing very rapidly. $45 billion. To put that into context for our viewers, it's $5 billion short of the total public debt for Kenya, an entire economy over in East Africa by itself. Now, we are, of course, going to be keeping a very close eye on exactly where that money is going to go and exactly what returns it will provide to those specific companies. But also there was an element of trade that cropped up in the conversation between the two presidents. There was a commitment from President Xi Jinping to try and essentially increase trade flows between the two countries. What we did not hear, however, are the exact means by which this will happen and what specific aspects of the economies will be targeted. Are we looking perhaps at a reduction in tariffs on both sides? Are we looking at an asymmetric reduction of tariffs? What sort of commodities are going to be targeted by these measures to improve trade flows? Those are the missing details. We'll be chasing those down over the next 48 to 72 hours. Uche?
Now, Rama, with regards to tomorrow's meeting, of course, BRICS leaders, as well as about 9 African heads of state, are expected to attend. Of course, as we mentioned, the threat of intensifying global trade tensions expected to dominate this week's discussion. So do you expect to see a sort of increased urgency amongst member states to speed up momentum at this year's summit?
Indeed, there's absolutely no getting away from that trade war question, is there? We've been speaking about it in all the pre-events running up to the summit that starts tomorrow. South Africa, of course, has gotten hit particularly badly. Its steel industry is facing 25% import tariffs from the United States. Its car industry could be targeted next as well. But remember, the theme of this year's BRICS summit is BRICS within the context of Africa. And that then leads to the next logical question. If there is a trade war and it does escalate to a really large extent, how will the rest of the continent's economies be affected? That's a question I put to Gabriel Nagatu. He's the Director General for East Africa at the African Development Bank. Well, let's start with expectations. 10th BRICS Summit now being held in Africa. What do you expect to see from this meeting?
I think the BRICS Summit will be an opportunity for, of course, first and foremost for the member countries to sort out some of the issues. But the expectation for the rest of Africa is that through South Africa, who is a member of the BRICS, the rest of Africa will also see more investment, more trade, more opportunities coming through this facility, this institution. And some of the other members that have traditionally not been very active, like Brazil and Russia in particular, are expected to increase their relations, trade relations, and other cooperations with the rest of Africa. So I hope to see, besides the internal issues that they need to clear, I hope to see some new investments coming into the continent through this institution. So there are still issues that are being worked out, but sooner or later, I think you will see an opening up for the rest of the continent, and they will have their own criteria for admission into the process. But eventually you'll see more countries being invited to join the BRICS. So I think African countries, economies that are progressing well, will sooner or later be invited either as friends of BRICS or as members of BRICS and benefiting from the resources that has come through the BRIC process.
If you look at BRICS as individual states, right, a lot of the engagement has been on a bilateral level, right? So China, biggest trading partner for a lot of African countries, India having a significant presence across the continent as well, South Africa obviously with a massive trade and investment presence in places like SADC. So from that perspective, there are quite a few countries in the West and the North perhaps would say, well, why is BRICS relevant to us?
Again, I think it's too early to draw that conclusion. It's still formation or post-formation stage, but once the institution itself has stabilized, I expect to see more African countries coming into the fold and benefiting from the BRIC process. But right now, in my view, it's premature to conclude that the rest of Africa will not benefit. How it will happen and so on will depend on the kind of agreements that come up. For example, the new bank that's being set up, I think you cannot be just lending to one another. Sooner or later, other countries will be invited to join. If you look at the Asia Infrastructure Development Bank, that initial funding was no African member countries, but now we have half a dozen African countries that have joined and are benefiting from it. So it's a matter of time until the BRIC countries get their processes sorted out, but sooner or later they will be invited to join.